we do have virtual assistants that basically, for the leasing, they coordinate kind of applications and when there's a vacancy, they put it up to do all the marketing. And so then we keep it very lean. So we do self-showing. So we have lock boxes on all the properties. And so they coordinate, they take kind of their license and they walk them through the process to go see the apartment. And so for that, we've been able to save, a lot of money on property management.
You're asking yourself, why am I doing this?
Smart people would know how to use all these different tools. They
start with something small.
You'll never get your entire organization if you don't pull off operations. Don't give up.
It can be as small as that.
I think you guys are going to have our last today.
What is going on, everybody? Welcome to the Delegate That podcast, where we discuss the art and science of delegation, business, management, and leadership. Today, I am looking forward to a great conversation with Mike Preshman. Mike, if you can, please go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us about your business.
Multifamily investor in the Boston area. I've been doing this for about 7 years full time. So basically, kind of in short, I own 220 units, kind of manage some of the assets. We have third-party management on some of the assets. And so basically kind of we buy and hold for cash flow. And so we started out about 10 years ago with vacation rentals and kind of doing kind of Airbnb and that kind of stuff. And so that business kind of grew over the first 3 years when we were doing it. And then we pivoted into multifamily kind of at first slowly, and then it kind of built up a machine to do a kind of a snowball effect where we kind of bought assets for cash flow. The assets would do quite well with appreciated value. And so we kind of keep buying and so forth. And so then with COVID, kind of the business really kind of took off. And so now we have 220 units without investors. So we have a couple of like debt investors, maybe a couple $100,000, but no equity investors. And so we're running this business. Again, we manage a lot of the assets. We have some third party. And just kind of the challenges of kind of growing the business, stabilizing the business, dealing with tenants and all different interesting challenges in this world. Excited to be here and share my story.
That sounds really awesome. 220 units, excuse me, no equity investors at all. How did you kind of build to 220 units? A lot of people, they'll obviously be raising capital, doing all of that sort of stuff to buy their apartment buildings and all of that. How did you kind of get started in this without jumping on the investor train?
So I think we jumped into the Airbnb space so about 10 years ago, Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and the opportunity there was kind of it was before it got oversaturated, and so we were able to buy assets relatively cheap. So we bought our first house for $350,000 that very quickly cash flowed like $50,000 a year. So basically like year one, year two, it started cash flowing. And so we used those funds, plus a little bit extra to buy another asset, right? So we bought another vacation rental on the Cape. And so again, that started cash flowing similar numbers. So now we were kind of cash flowing $100,000 a year. And then we bought a third building the third year. So kind of the first 3 years I was all in on Airbnb vacation rentals. And so the third asset was also cash flowing $50,000 a year, roughly, eventually like 60. And so between the three assets, we were kind of making $150,000 per year that we were not kind of buying fancy things, or we were basically saving those funds and reinvesting it into other assets, right? And so by the time I realized after we had those assets for a couple of years, I realized that basically, vacation rentals are very difficult to manage, very stressful dealing with tenants. And so even though I had some help, like I had a full-time cleaning person, I had not a full-time, but a person that was, fully kind of on the property doing all the cleanings. We decided to pivot, right? Because it wasn't sustainable. It was stressful. You live and die by the review, all that jazz. And so at that point, that's kind of like I started, I was listening to BiggerPockets. I was really kind of getting my head around multifamily. And so that's when, I used those funds to buy my first multifamily. So we bought a 6-unit multifamily. and then that same year we bought, and so again, the prices were very different back then than they are now. And so that same year we bought a 5 unit, we bought a 9 unit, and we bought 5, 9, and a 4, right? So that was the very first year that I got into multifamily. That was about 7 years ago. And so all those assets, and so the way that we bought those assets, so the prices back then, they were like, $400,000, $500,000, so they weren't millions of dollars as they are today. And so the way that I was able to there was different ways. So one was, I got a hard money loan and refinanced it, right, and back out, right. One, I had the actual funds. One, I brought in an investor at the time. So I had $200,000 he put down. So he put down all of the equity at that moment. But since then, I've bought them out and I own the asset outright. And so, for example, that asset is in Manchester, New Hampshire, that we purchased at the time for $750,000. He put down $200,000 to buy the asset. At the time, the rent roll there was about maybe $10,000 a month, right? So now each one of the apartments, it's 9 apartments, all 4 bedrooms. Now they're all renting at about $2,500 a door. And so the asset right now, I actually have it on the market for $2.3 million, right? So that's 7 years later, right? So really the market really appreciated. And so a lot of that is not necessarily skill. It's just being at the right place at the right time and taking, calculated risk, as in I definitely had a calculation, like what's the worst case scenario, what's the best case scenario. But just because the relatively best case scenario panned out doesn't necessarily mean that I could have predicted that COVID was going to happen, the prices were going to rise that much, rents were going to go up that much, all that kind of stuff. So, so because that asset was cash flowing, because all the assets that I was buying were basically cash flowing, when I was doing very, very basic math, like back of the napkin math, like what's the monthly potential using rentometer, figuring out what the rents can be, pushing the rents using housing and different departments to get top rents, and then reusing those funds to reinvest the money back into multifamily. And so initially it was slow, right? And then it goes a little bit faster and then faster. And then, and so then over time, the snowball, got going where we eventually built up to getting a very, very, very substantial cash flow, where instead of buying Lamborghinis and that kind of stuff, we just continue to put it back into real estate.
Do you feel overwhelmed with mundane tasks that eat up your valuable time? It's time to reclaim your schedule and focus on what truly matters. Get your time back with elite remote talent without the time zone hassle. Delegate $10 an hour tasks to focus on more $1,000 an hour tasks. Schedule your free strategy call at �57.io.
That's fantastic. I love the idea of putting it back into real estate. It's always a great route to go. Right now, it tends to be a little bit tougher. I'd love to hear. I'll ask you in a little bit about current market, but I want to compare and contrast what you were looking at team wise when you had like your vacation rentals. You had 3 vacation rentals. You said you already had a team that was going, but it was still a lot to manage. And then it's funny to hear that was a lot to manage, and now we're transitioning into 220 units. What does the team look like when you go from 3 vacation rentals to 220 multifamily units? What does your team structure look like? How did you change things? What sort of systems did you have to put in place?
So when we had the vacation rentals, I was working full time and I was managing the vacation rentals. So I was very hands on, and so I was, I would answer all the bookings. I would talk to all the guests and so forth, and so when we started growing, some of the assets that are located a little bit further away, so maybe like a couple hours away from where we live. So we have some stuff. We live in Boston, so we have some stuff in Western Mass. We have some stuff in parts of New Hampshire. So there we have some third-party management, and then so we ourselves probably manage about 120 units, and so for the leasing and for the maintenance, so we have a couple of virtual assistants, right? So we work with virtual assistants from the Philippines, as I'm sure a lot of people, and so they've been pretty good. So I can't say that it's one of those perfect situations where everything is done exactly how you want it, et cetera. But there is we do have virtual assistants that basically, for the leasing, they coordinate applications and when there's a vacancy, they put it up to do all the marketing. And so then we keep it very lean. So we do self-showing. So we have lockboxes on all the properties. And so they coordinate, they take kind of their license and they walk them through the process to go see the apartment. And so for that, we've been able to save, a lot of money on property management, where property management, not only on third-party property management, not only are you kind of paying the property management, but also they spend way more than you would, right? They're not as, it's not their money. So they're really not as, careful about the spend and so forth, the expenses. So, and then on the maintenance side, kind of similar things. So we have kind of a virtual assistant that takes kind of maintenance requests and coordinates with. So we have one person that works full time, one maintenance person that works full time, and so this guy has been with me now for like probably 6 or 7 years, and so he does everything, right? And so he's a jack of all trades, like a master of none, right? But he's sort of a master, but he's just very not. Like his finishes are not going to be perfect, right? He's not, but he's very fast. He does everything, right? And so that's kind of some trade-offs that I have to make is, I have this person. And so now we've been together for a long time and we work well together. And so he's always on site. He's always doing stuff he'll drive around the properties. He'll do everything, right? And so that, really cuts our costs rather than having, multiple people or hiring, contractors or dealing with third-party property management. So I would say that that's kind of and then kind of the main component of this is that about 3.5 years ago, my wife, so she used to be kind of a, marketing director or whatever. And I basically convinced her to quit and to come work with me. Because the main reason is that, it's kind of like I trust her, like with finances, with paying the bills, with our bank accounts, like all that stuff, right? So 100% trust, right? I don't have to think twice about it. If I have another person, then it becomes an outside. It's a business, right? It's a bigger business. There's a lot more risk. There's a lot more stress. Whereas, with her, we work at our pace, right? And so there's days that on Saturdays, on Sundays where we're working because but then there's every day we kind of choose our schedule in a way, unless the schedule chooses us, I guess, if we have flyers and so forth. But, as an example, we, this summer, we went away to Europe for 6 weeks, right? A little over 6 weeks where we spent away with our kids and so forth, right? And so the business ran itself. We were involved, right? So we would be on the phone. We would talk to my contractor. We would watch the leasing line, all that kind of stuff. But we were away. And the business, didn't fall apart, right? So that's fantastic. It doesn't mean that we weren't involved. It doesn't mean that we weren't, didn't have stresses here and there. It doesn't mean that I didn't have to dial into a court hearing for an eviction, right? So all that stuff for sure was still happening. But we've created a little bit of a business that, and I'll say that in general, my philosophy around this is that. People are great. Like if you have good people, it's fundamentally, it can change the trajectory of your business. And, for example, I owe a lot to this contractor that I have, because without him, I don't know if I'd have 220 units. Like, it was just a very different, for example, when I just bought that Manchester house that I mentioned, we had, it was very early on in my investment career. We had the roof was leaking and it was wintertime. And I got quotes from like all these companies, and they were basically quoting me like $50,000, right? It was wintertime, et cetera. And so this guy basically said, we can do it ourselves. And I was like, so we did it ourselves. It's a 9-unit property, all 4 bedrooms. It's like 3 triple deckers, side by side. And we changed it ourselves, and it cost me like $12,000, right, to buy all the material and to do all the work, right? So to save. And I was miserable, right? I think I caught COVID then. Like I was, it was probably the worst, few days of my life. But right, I saved $30,000 or over $30,000 at the time. That was really, really, really. It's always important, but back then that was make it or break it kind of a situation, right? So, but back to my earlier point is simplifying, right? Having a very simple, like you don't want to depend on very smart, genius hires. You want to have simple systems, simple businesses, in my opinion, right? Like, so for me, it's having good assets or having assets that cash flow despite, I don't want to have somebody rescuing my assets. I want to have assets that are going to do regardless of who's managing them.
I love it. Yeah. And I love that you put it in your own hands as well, because, I had one property management company. it turns out that after we sold our asset with them, they started getting sued by a bunch of people, and then they were like defrauding a bunch of people, and they were doing all sorts of stuff. And it was weird because I would ask a few questions about books, and it would always turn out that the answers were not quite where I was trying to get them to go. It's like, I don't understand what's happening here, So to keep it in house and keep it right there with you and your wife. I love that you talked about your wife being 100%. Obviously trustworthy. I would hope so. You married her, right? So that's a wonderful thing. I'm curious, what sort of people love the idea of being able to take those 6 weeks off in Europe, like you talked about doing. What sort of systems and processes, what sort of software things do you use that help you be able to step away for 6 weeks, but still be able to keep the pulse of the company?
So my phone, but we have open phone. So we have this system. I think they just now changed the name to 𝗟𝗃, but it's basically a virtual phone system. So there's several lines. So we have like a line for acquisitions. We have a line for property management. We have a line for leasing, right? And so all the communication with potential tenants, with current tenants, with potential buyers, or no, for potential people that are trying to sell their assets or whatever. But so basically. So that system, virtual phone system, is kind of like the number one thing that I would say is, critical. Then we have a property management system. And so in there, that's just like where all the tenants pay rent, submit maintenance requests, things of that nature. So we use 𝗟𝗫𝘀𝗀𝘀 for that, which is pretty good. Or we've just used it for a long time, so we're not going to switch at this point. And then we have, so we use Notion for a lot of stuff, right? So we have kind of like forms and Notion. And so the idea there is that like when we have kind of like these like forms where if a potential tenant for leasing, for example, wants to rent an apartment, they see an ad, we'll send them a link. They fill out an inquiry with like their license and kind of their background and where they work and all this kind of stuff, right? So that's kind of the first step to get them into our system, to start processing them. And so then kind of the virtual system will take over and they'll coordinate the showing and all this kind of stuff, right? But you can see all that communication. And then internally with the leasing and the property management between kind of my wife, and I would say that, in a way, my wife is like, from a, like I would be the CEO and she's the COO, right? Or basically like, so she, on the operations side, if I'm the visionary and she's the integrator, right? So she basically, and it's not like, I don't want to put her into a role, right? I don't want to force her to do like, a job that she doesn't necessarily want. Like at the end of the day, the idea is to own a business that makes money and you have freedom to do whatever you want, right? Which, by the way, is a whole other kind of conversation. That's not necessarily the answer to happiness. That we can talk about that another time. But like 6 weeks in Europe could be too long, right? Yeah. So what was I saying? I lost my train of thought. Got excited about 6 weeks in Europe.
The integrator, you don't want to put your wife into this.
She will watch so we have like a Slack channel internally, right? Or Slack channels. And so she will be kind of like speaking with the virtual assistants, answering any questions. And so she'll be in charge of like, paying all the bills. Like if she wasn't around, none of the bills would get paid, if it was up to me. Not because, but just because I'm, that's not, my focus is more kind of maybe acquisitions or strategy or, and it's not because it's just kind of how I'm wired. Like I get bored quickly with like tasks that are repetitive, right? I just can't rely on myself to, like, I can do it once or 10 times, but if you tell me to do it forever, I can't do it. So that's kind of the things that really helped us. And then, just having, so my maintenance guy, I'd have a call with him probably every day from Spain. And so, but he would go around the properties, he would do the work, right? So if there was an apartment that needs to be renovated, if somebody had a maintenance request, right? So he would go and he would take care of stuff. And when we came back, maybe the load of stuff, maybe there's a little bit of a backlog. Maybe there's, 20% more of things to do, 10% more, whatever it is, but it's doable, right? So we're still here. But for sure, my so to continue that trajectory, kind of my goal right now is to continue to acquire strong assets, right? And so I love cash flow, and my cash flow is solid. But one of the things that comes with really solid cash flow is you have difficult tenants and you have difficult properties, right? And so I'm kind of looking at to transition more into assets that can sustain themselves a little bit better over time, right? So basically, commercial assets, maybe things that cash flow a little bit less, but a little more stable, a little bit more predictable. Where you're not kind of guessing, is this person going to pay rent or not, right? That kind of stuff. Yeah, so that's kind of I think my current philosophy on this a little bit. Yeah.
Very good. I like it. How many VAs would you say you have on your team right now?
Just two. Right now we have. We've oscillated. At times I thought. I've thought about. And right now I'm thinking about acquiring one more for acquisitions, but it's a hit or miss, right? It's a hit or miss. I mean, the person that right now we've had for the longest time, she's been with us for a few years, and when we hired her, I wasn't sure. Like I thought she might be good, but she was really cheap and humble and young, and she kind of like grew into the role, and so she's just been she's a machine. Like she just does her leasing role. Now for a couple of years, and she's not getting bored, and she's not, she's doing a fantastic job, right? So sometimes you never know. Whereas other people that really sounded, very articulate and really kind of sold themselves, right? But then, maybe they had multiple jobs, or just for whatever reason it didn't necessarily work out, right? So for that reason, I'm pretty cautious around, because for me one of the challenges, I guess, is like, when you have somebody who is not, the philosophy is if somebody's not working out and you notice, fire them right away, right? So a lot of people are kind of like, fire quick, hire slowly, right? And then, but for me, firing somebody is then another huge thing to do, right? Which is I have to go and interview somebody and hire a new person and train a new person and so forth. And so it's not that I want to keep somebody bad on board, but that's why I'm very careful about hiring, and maybe I have a little bit more of a tolerance for somebody who's not perfect but good enough, right? And so I kind of, and so that goes the same thing with like, my contractor. In a lot of ways, he is not like a lot of people might if they have like very high standards about their buildings or whatever, they're just gonna say no, this is not gonna work for me because like he painted and his line is crooked, or he fixed a leak and then the leak's 5 days later or whatever, right? But for me, it's kind of like, well, it's a trade-off, right? Like and you have to understand that at the end of the day, business is imperfect, right? And and you have to accept some imperfections and so forth. And it's like every business is a dumpster fire, and just some happen to make money, right? So I heard that quote somewhere. So yeah.
Yeah, it is absolutely a truism that every business is a dumpster fire, at least at some point in somewhere underneath some hood. It's a dumpster fire there, right? So,
sure.
I want to kind of jump on the fact that you said, you're not getting the perfect employee. You may not have, and I think that's something that, it's kind of a fallacy similar to passive income, right? Where it's like, okay, yeah, we could all say the word passive income, but if you're actually making that income, it's not passive. You're doing work one way or another. Whether it's at the beginning or whether it's somewhere in the middle, there's always going to be work in there. It's not all that passive, and it's a sliding scale as well. So it's the same thing with our employees. Not every employee is going to be able to do exactly the way you want it to be done, exactly the things you want to be able to do, which is why we implement systems and processes to make sure that it still gets done in a way that is effective. Do you have written down SOPs? Do you have all of that stuff that everybody knows kind of how to work inside of the business?
No.
Wow! All right, I'm looking forward to this.
So I'll say, so the true answer is no. I can lie, but I've done all that, right? So I've created SOPs. I've gone through all the stuff, right? And then but then everything changes, and then you don't update them, and then they get stale, and so that's been kind of like the true reality is that it doesn't for me. And so now, like if we had to bring in a new virtual assistant, we probably have some SOPs for them to start from and so forth. But at the end of the day, I think we'd still have to explain, and a lot of stuff has changed. And I also haven't. So again, like there's people out there that are way more successful at hiring good virtual assistants and have much larger teams and have much larger businesses and so forth, right? And so for me, like I've kind of like figured out what works for me and kind of like the size of the business and the type of business. And so I really believe in kind of like what I do in terms of the underlying business mechanics of what these assets generate, the kind of income, the kind of lifestyle that it gives me, right? But it's not the same as a lot of other people are, preaching or following or so forth, right? So I think you kind of have to figure out yourself, and kind of like figure out what kind of business works for you. For me, kind of I fell into this opportunity, sort of by accident, like with listening to a podcast and then kind of getting into, and so forth. And so once the income started coming in, and once I realized, how this works and so forth, right? And even still today, like, I'm still trying to figure out, like, I go to some of these, masterminds and conferences and people that have, these large commercial real estate businesses, but they're running syndication businesses, right? And so they're running these large machines, right? But under the hood, like, is there cash flow? Like, is it generating enough cash flow? Is it a sustainable business, right? Or are you still, just running a job, right? You have a job where you're dependent on the next deal, right? Or otherwise you have to lay people off and so forth, right? So for me, kind of, I figured out, and partially I figured it out, partially I fully recognize that, today it's much more difficult to kind of get to where I am today. Like it'll take a lot longer if possible, right? But with that said, I'm always trying to iterate. Like I'm always trying to stay nimble and kind of, if something was working a couple of years ago, it probably isn't working today. So what is the new strategy, right? You have to figure it out. And, and so for me, kind of that mindset, like kind of the true underlying kind of like intelligence is like being that, knowing that you know nothing, sort of, right? And so being humble in that regard. And so for me, despite, figuring out something within this business, right? It would be a lot of hubris for me to assume that it was because of my skill or it was because I can repeat it again, right? So I kind of have to, right? If I want to continue succeeding, I have to have that mindset in order to outmaneuver the situation in the future, right? And that's kind of my mentality. And so,
love that. Yeah, it's one of those things that I think the early 2020s, 2020 to 2023, told a lot of people how amazing they were, as opposed to,
100%,
they were like, oh, I'm so awesome, I'm the best operator in the entire world. And then, reality comes and smacks them in the face come 2024, 2025. And it's not exactly what they thought it was going to be, So I love that you're telling yourself, hey, like this is not me. I got to keep constantly staying on it. I've got to keep making sure that things are going well, and understand what the market is doing and where it's going. I'm curious, because you don't have those SOPs in place, because you don't, because you're constantly kind of reassessing those, and you have long-term employees, right? Your maintenance people, your VAs have been with you a long time. Let's look at those worst case scenarios. I always try to look at things, on my house. Like, what happens if I get hit by a bus? What's taken care of here at the house? Same thing in business. What happens if I get hit by a bus? What happens if you lose one of those long-term employees? What sort of things do you, how do you see the transition to a new employee? How do you look at moving somebody else into one of those positions? Because, you may not need an SOP right now because they've been there for so long, but what does that look like after?
Yeah, I think that would be a huge challenge. So I know that's so for example, my maintenance guy who does everything, right? So he's kind of, I spoke to him already this morning. He's at a site. He was there last week. So he, if something happened to him, it would just be basically a lot more expensive to replace him, because we pay him we pay him like it's $1,750 per week, right? So every week he gets $1,750, or he's full time. I give him some time off, etc. But so it's not a low salary, but he gets a lot done. Like he'll go, and so instead of having to find people, etc., he does everything, right? So if I had to replace his work, and so he'll do plumbing, right, within reason, right? He'll do electrical when needed, like light kind of stuff, right? So and everything else in between, right? And so if I had to replace him, right, I would try to find somebody analogous, but most likely I would have to piecemeal it and find kind of like local people and so forth. And so it would just, for at least a short time, it would be a lot more expensive, right? Virtual assistants probably could replace, for leasing, for property management, for maintenance, that kind of stuff. So I think we could replace. My wife is obviously irreplaceable. So I think it's doable, right? So we have, for example, back to imperfections, right? So we have a few property management companies that we work for, so third-party property management companies, and so with them, we've been together now for a few years with both of them, and so one, we have like a lot of assets in one area, and so they, they are often not perfect, right? So oftentimes there's just things that aren't getting done, or we've had a falling out at one point, or so there's been issues, right? And yet switching is a big context switch, right? It's a big additional headache with a lot of uncertainty, and so I've been reluctant to do it, and so I've been okay with, okay, like this too shall pass, right? Like, and so part of it is like I'm trying to lower my risk by selling a couple of the assets that they manage, and so when I sell those assets, I'll de-risk some of those positions, and so they'll have less that they're managing. And so there are other options, but there's no guarantee that another option will be better. So for sure, we're small and nimble and very involved. So like in terms of operations, very kind of aware of, so I go to court, and so for example, being involved in the business, like so I go to court. So in New Hampshire, you can do your own evictions. In Massachusetts, you can't. And so when I go to court in New Hampshire, I decided one time, you know what, I'm done with this. Let me hire a lawyer. And so I hired a lawyer. And when I was in Europe, and so I dialed into that call, and then I get a bill from the lawyer to do one eviction for somebody that basically didn't pay their rent, et cetera, and it was $4,500, right? So the lawyer, and the people didn't even show up to court, right? So there was nothing. He just delivered papers, literally zero complexity, no $4,500 because of whatever, right? Because of the process, right? And so I said, screw this, right? So $4,500, right? Like it's a very substantial amount of money for one eviction. So I, for example, like on that eviction, I lost like $30,000 all in because they ruined the apartment, because of the amount of money that they owned, et cetera. And so sometimes doing it yourself as you are kind of like continue to build your business, right? That is exactly the kind of money that then I can put into other deals, right? As opposed to if I hand everything off and have a very passive lifestyle, I'm really kind of minimizing or limiting the amount of funds that I can put back into real estate, right? So I'm sure at some point, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, I'm gonna, take a seat back and take a back seat and kind of let my assets do their thing, and I can go write a book or do whatever else I want, right? But for now, I'm still trying to grow and still trying to kind of. So I am, but it's a calculated thing, right? It's I'm definitely making calculated decisions about where I want to be involved, where it makes sense, where we, like, for example, when I started, I would if somebody had a broken fridge, I have a truck, I would go and I would get a fridge on on Facebook Marketplace, and I would drive it there. Right now, we just get a fridge from Home Depot, right? So kind of we've evolved.
Yeah. No, I really love what you're doing, and I love the. So many people, especially in kind of like the circles that we're around a lot, are always, you have to have all these systems, you have to have all these processes, you have to make sure that you're doing this, that's going on. And it's like, well, no, if it doesn't make sense for your business, like, it's one of those chew the meat, spit out the bones, and you're being very calculated in the meat that you want to chew on and getting rid of the stuff that doesn't make sense. And I love the way you're thinking about it. It's like you said, some calculated decisions that are needed to be made, but you're involved enough. You know the business, you know the insides and outs, you know where to go. So worst case scenario, you take over certain parts until you find the right replacement. So I love that. I love the thought process there.
Yeah, for now, I'm still okay with that, and that's also kind of part of what has allowed. I think it's like you need to have a little bit of like blind faith, sort of, right? So like when I started out with these, like buying some of these assets, like I had no idea what I was doing, and but I just kind of like believed that, okay, like I have a truck, like I'm a young guy, I'm strong. If I have to, I'm going to go and do the work, right? Whatever, like I'll paint the apartment if I have to, right? That was the beginning, right? I didn't have to do that. And so now, and I've hired, different contractors that haven't worked out, but sort of, just kind of like being comfortable, being uncomfortable at times. Has kind of has been important. Yeah. So, and everything, I think everything, the way that I think about decision making oftentimes is, I kind of look at kind of for me, nothing is black and white, right? So basically so I have this framework. I used to play poker when I was younger. So I have this framework around probabilistic thinking where, nothing is deterministic, right? So no decision, like literally nothing, like including the sun coming up, right? Including you being born tomorrow, right? And so for that, you kind of assign a probability for kind of different decision trees, and so you are basically optimizing your decisions over a long period of time, right? So basically, you are any given decision can go wrong, right? And that's okay. Like you still possibly made the right decision. So if one outcome is 90% and another outcome is 10%, you certainly hope and expect that 90% to go, but 10% can happen. It doesn't mean that you made the wrong decision, right? It means that, kind of probability played itself out. And so as long as the 10% doesn't kill you, right? As long as you kind of protect your downside and you kind of have an upside, on most scenarios, right? You're going to win eventually. And so I kind of make that quick calculated decision with every, I think that's kind of like my superpower is I make that very quick decision on, every purchase at Home Depot or every, decision, do we renovate this apartment or not? And so the kind of the calculation is, is very fast. But it really kind of like helps me have a framework around making optimal decisions. And so with the running this business, right, it's kind of like, just going back to like having a perfect virtual assistant, or like what happens if somebody, if something happens to one of my employees, right? Okay, I'm not perfect. That's not the scenario that I wanted, but it won't kill me, right? But I assign a certain probability around it, which is okay. Like the probability of that happens is, let's say 10%, and if that 10% happens, this year, then this is how I'm going to handle it, and this is the loss that I'll take. But the 90% is right. So I kind of overall kind of like I'm driving the car with the vision to win, just like, I don't know if you play poker, but if you're playing poker, right, any given hand, even if you have the best possible hand, you can lose that hand, right? But if you play correctly over a long period of time, you're likely to win over the course of a day, a week, a month, et cetera, right? So that's kind of the philosophy that I try to kind of bring to my business and bring to my life.
I think it's a great way to look at it, setting up the probabilistic nature of it and making sure that, the probabilities are that you're going to do well and you keep it going. And as long as you're making the decisions that move you in that right direction, then what else can you do? So, Mike, it's been awesome kind of hearing the way that you look at business, how you're managing your properties, how you're managing your business. I've really appreciated the different perspective that you have. And I'm positive that those listening also appreciate that. So if somebody's listening to this and they want to reach out to you to learn a little bit more about what you do or learn a little bit more about you, what's the best way for folks to get a hold of you?
Yeah. If somebody wants to, so our website is bnpliving.com. And then you can email me directly. Happy to chat to 𝗟𝗶𝘀𝗁@gmail.com. That's 𝗟𝗶𝘀@gmail.com. Happy to chat about literally anything, business, Go Abundance, poker, life, kids, what have you, gym, what have you. So I'm pretty versatile, excited about life, but please reach out. Happy to chat.
Absolutely love it, Mike. Thank you so very much for jumping on. I really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody who's listening as well. I appreciate you spending some time with us today. If you thought this was a useful conversation, please share it with somebody. Like and subscribe as well. Comment below. Let us know what your favorite part was. Let us know what you agree with and what you disagree with, and we'll go ahead and fight about it in the comments. So we thank you so very much for jumping in and listening. And Mike, we thank you for jumping on the call, and we will see everybody on the next show.
Thanks for having me. This was great. Appreciate it.